Many times in our public policy world we invoke the term historic, but quite clearly there are two processes of multilateral negotiation currently underway that will fundamentally affect the future of the global economy, of the pathways of national economies, and quite clearly they are the Doha round and they are the negotiations leading up to and through Copenhagen on climate change. I don't have to explain in this forum why the Doha round is so critical to the future of a global marketplace and the future of the global economy. That is known. We also know the reasons for why it is struggling, just as we understand the reasons for why a meaningful deal in Copenhagen is currently struggling as well. And the reasons have nothing to do with the science of climate change, nor with the technological possibilities, nor with the policy feasibility of addressing a deal in Copenhagen or reaching a deal in Copenhagen that is in line with the targets identified by the IPCC. As you all know, the Secretary General has just launched a Seal the Deal campaign, and very much at the heart of this objective is that Copenhagen must stand up to the litmus test of whether it can deliver a global response to climate change in line with the analysis and the scenarios laid out by the IPCC. However, much of the debate centers around the economic implications, consequences, but also opportunities. And in that sense, I do believe that the coincidence of the Doha trade negotiations and now the focus of Copenhagen and climate change are perhaps an extraordinary moment in terms of multilateralism, but also an extraordinary moment in terms of determining whether climate change policies and the actions that will flow from that are on the one hand compatible with WTO rules, but equally, at this time in humanity's history, to what extent are WTO rules compatible with an imperative to address climate change, which means to address carbon emissions and to address the drivers of global warming, which are greenhouse gas emissions in general. I want to thank, first of all, Pascal again and his team for what is a groundbreaking collaboration. And it is not one, as he has emphasized, that is trying to give the world a prescription of how to act. It is rather trying to inform the world of a fundamentally important principle, that the trade communities and the climate change communities must look for a much more proactive interface at this stage, because to some extent the effectiveness of a climate change regime agreed by over 190 nations will in part depend on how the regulatory framework governing the global marketplace and world trade will act, and the reverse is equally true. So our joint report today is meant to be, first of all, a signal that the climate change and trade agendas are inextricably linked. Secondly, it builds on a body of work that many institutions have tried to take forward in recent years, whether in think tanks, in civil society, inside our respective institutions, inside the United Nations as a whole. And in that sense, putting all of this between two covers is meant to help the climate change and the trade communities to recognize both the opportunities and perhaps some of the constraints that need to be addressed to have a mutually supportive set of international agreements emerge. It is also quite clear that trade is sometimes in our debate on climate change an ambivalent factor. As Pascal just said, it can either contribute to global warming, and clearly increased economic activity, increase in global trade is at first sight an increase in carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases. The question is, how can trade also become part of a global effort to reduce emissions, to become more efficient, to have a more sustainable consumption and production platform for the global economy, and thereby make trade part of the solution than either just a parallel process or, in the worst case scenario, a process that accelerates global warming. There is no question that our global economy, and this is more starkly obvious at this particular moment, is dependent on a continued enabling policy framework for trade to thrive. The question is if that pathway is incompatible with what has become in many respects, for some already, a survival question, but certainly for the long-term viability of our global economy, a key strategic challenge, namely global warming. If these two cannot become mutually supportive, then sooner or later something has to give. And what is much more difficult to conceive is how do you deal with a global warming scenario above 2 degrees, where you reach tipping points where disruptive impacts on our global and national economies will far outstretch or outpass the implications of a decline temporary of trade volumes. Climate change is also, in the broader sense of the processes now underway, going to impact on key sectors that are of particular relevance to developing economies today, be it agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. Not only in terms of the mitigation agenda, but also the adaptation agenda, it is crucial that we look at how climate change needs to be factored into a proactive trade policy regime, because it will alter not only the nature of international trade, but even the comparative advantages on which countries build their trade strategy today. But perhaps at the heart of this report lies also the message that trade can, in fact, become a driver for a global economy that can become much more quickly a low-carbon global economy, in which energy efficiency, moving away from fossil fuel-based energy production systems, not abandoning them, but initiating the transition, and initiating it in a way that 190-plus countries can participate in that transformative process, and not simply a few, could be a critical part of it. That has to do with the trade regime as much as the climate change regimes that are now being negotiated. Clearly, the report identifies that trade is a significant driver of technology diffusion, of innovation, of accelerating international markets that can become part of an effort of what we in UNEP would refer to a transition towards a green economy. National policies will clearly be derived from the international agreements under Doha and in terms of Copenhagen. It is critical from our point of view that in the run-up to Copenhagen, as much as in the context of Doha, these issues and agendas be looked at proactively, and not only by the few who are thinking ahead, but in fact by all negotiators, and particularly also at the national level between trade negotiators and those negotiating the international climate policy. I end by simply saying that we must maximize the opportunities for addressing global warming and the response to it in terms of the climate change negotiations, while also ensuring that the further evolution of the international trade regime maximizes opportunities for all countries to benefit from it, and also to avoid what is sometimes seen as a warning sign in terms of a climate change negotiation, to allow protectionism, trade protectionism, to become, in a sense, a perverse outcome of these negotiations. Business as usual will not prevail. And from the perspective of where we look at the future today, there is no question in my mind that the transition towards a green economy will become the driving principle for our global marketplace, as much as for virtually every nation's national economic and development path policy strategy. And this is no longer a question of industrialized or wealthy nations. In fact, if you look at the leadership in many developing countries today, they are at the forefront of articulating precisely this challenge. I can point to Rwanda and President Kagame. I can point to President Calderon and the latest climate change policies there. I can point to President Lee's green growth strategy in Korea. You can look at Ghana, where Green Ghana has become a principle around which the new government is organizing its policies, and we could go on and on. The transition towards a green economy is as much now the backdrop against which also trade policy must continue to evolve as it is in its own right. Thank you.